Gunfire echoed off the valley walls, not from a battle, but from men drunk on whiskey and the sheer release of wilderness life. A line of horses kicked through the sage while traders shouted prices over the roar of voices. Smoke from 100 campfires drifted upward, carrying the smells of roasting buffalo meat and pipe tobacco. French curses tangled with English oaths, and native drums rose in time with whoops from mountain men who hadn't seen civilization in years. It was the annual Rendezvous, a gathering of the roughest, wildest souls the Rockies had ever known. The tradition began in the 1820s, when the American fur trade reached deep into the Rocky Mountains. The beaver hat craze in Europe had created a hunger for pelts, and men poured westward to trap the streams that ran cold and clean from the peaks. They lived solitary lives through the winter and spring, setting steel traps beneath icy water, skinning beaver, and packing pelts into bundles. Supplies ran low, and isolation ate at the edges of sanity. Traders and company men saw a solution. Rather than force trappers to return to St. Louis each year, they would bring trade goods to them. Out of that need was born the Rendezvous. The first organized gathering took place in 1825 in the Green River Valley of present-day Wyoming. William Ashley, a former general turned fur entrepreneur, sent wagons loaded with gunpowder, lead, traps, blankets, knives, whiskey, and tobacco to meet his scattered hunters. Trappers, native allies, and traders converged by the hundreds. What began as simple commerce quickly exploded into a frontier carnival. Every summer afterward, for nearly 2 decades, the Mountain Rendezvous became legend. Locations shifted between the Green River, Pierre's Hole in Idaho, the Wind River Range, and other broad valleys, with water and grass enough for thousands of horses. Trappers arrived lean and weathered, their packs bulging with beaver pelts. Native nations, including the Crow, Shoshone, Flathead, Ute, and others, came to trade horses, buffalo robes, and knowledge of the land. Company men from St. Louis rolled in with wagons and mule trains groaning under manufactured goods. The two sides met in a chaos of bargaining, drinking, boasting, and sometimes fighting. The atmosphere defied law and order. Whiskey flowed from kegs in raw streams. Men fired rifles into the air for sport, or at each other for grudges that had festered alone in the high country. Knife fights flared, and stories tell of men who fell in duels settled in the dust. Yet alongside the violence was camaraderie. Trappers told tales of grisly encounters, of winters survived on roots and leather, of rivers swollen with spring melt that swallowed men whole. These stories carried across the firelight, part warning, part entertainment, each one stitched into the mythology of the frontier. Rendezvous also bound cultures together, however uneasily. Native women played a central role, exchanging hides and beadwork, mending clothes, guiding parties, and marrying into the lives of trappers who otherwise might never have survived. The meetings were a collision of languages: French, English, Spanish, and dozens of indigenous tongues, where trade hands and gestures often spoke clearer than words. In the noise of drums, fiddle music, and rifle cracks, a new kind of frontier society took shape, one that existed for only a few weeks each year, but lived forever in memory. The scale of these gatherings was staggering. At their height, thousands of people might converge. Horses blanketed the meadows, grazing in herds that looked like moving plains. Piles of pelts rose in pyramids as men haggled over prices. Company clerks scribbled in ledgers, while men, too drunk to stand, gambled their winter's haul on a roll of dice. To walk the camp was to move through every extreme of human behavior: bravery, recklessness, cruelty, generosity, compressed into a single valley. Stories of famous mountain men echoed through each rendezvous. Jim Bridger told of discovering the Great Salt Lake. Hugh Glass, mauled by a grizzly and left for dead, became a legend retold in hushed awe. Jedediah Smith spoke of pushing farther into unknown ranges, mapping trails others would follow. These men walked among their peers like living myths, but at the fire they were just part of the noise, drinking and laughing until dawn. Not all ended in celebration. The 1832 rendezvous at Pierre's Hole erupted into a pitched battle when trappers, their native allies, and a rival Gros Ventre band clashed. Gunfire and arrows turned the meadow into a battlefield, leaving bodies strewn among the grass. Even amid trade and festivity, the frontier's tension was never far from the surface. For all its chaos, the rendezvous served its purpose. Trappers exchanged pelts for powder, lead, cloth, tobacco, and tools that would see them through another year. Traders packed mountains of beaver skins into wagons and mule trains bound east. Fortunes changed hands in the span of days, and when the rendezvous ended, the valley emptied, leaving only ashes, broken bottles, and trails cut into the grass. Men rode back into the wild, and the land grew silent again until the next summer. By the 1840s, the heyday of the rendezvous began to fade. Beaver populations were hunted nearly to collapse, and fashion in Europe shifted from beaver felt to silk hats. The demand that had driven men into the mountains evaporated almost overnight. Companies withdrew. Some mountain men settled into trading posts or guided the swelling waves of emigrant wagons heading west. Others vanished into the wilderness, living on as relics of a time already slipping into story. The last great rendezvous came in 1840 at the Green River. It was smaller, more subdued, and carried the weight of farewell. The mountain men knew the world had shifted. Trails once known only to them would soon be rutted by wagon wheels. Valleys that had echoed with gunfire and laughter would be crossed by farmers, missionaries, and settlers with families. The age of the fur trade, and the wild celebrations that punctuated it, was closing. Yet the memory of those gatherings outlived the trade itself. Writers and later historians painted them as the rough heart of the frontier, places where men lived without rules, where wilderness and humanity collided in the rawest form. The legends of Bridger, Smith, Carson, and Glass were preserved partly because they had been told and retold around those firelit camps, carried east and woven into the myth of the American West. Stand in the valleys of Wyoming or Idaho today, and you can still sense the scale of it. Broad meadows run to the mountains, rivers cut the ground with silver lines, and wind moves the grass in waves. For a few weeks each summer nearly 2 centuries ago, these places held the center of the frontier world. Smoke rose, horses thundered, and the mountain men's rendezvous carved itself into memory, a fleeting carnival of survival, trade, and legend. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.